Have you ever had the feeling that you're standing right at the edge of something that could quietly change the way you see everything? Not a loud revelation, not a dramatic moment, just a subtle sense that what you've believed about reality might not be the whole story. It often appears without warning, in a pause between thoughts, in a moment of silence that feels heavier than it should. You can't explain it, but you feel it. Something doesn't fully add up anymore. The world works, life moves on, yet a quiet question keeps returning. Most people ignore that feeling. They stay busy, they move on, but you didn't. You stopped, even for a moment. And that matters, because once this question shows up, it's not trying to confuse you. It's trying to prepare you for a truth that few are willing to face. What you're feeling right now is not random, and it's not a flaw in you. It's not stress that forgot to leave, or boredom wearing a philosophical mask. It has a very specific texture, doesn't it? A kind of quiet pressure, like a question forming before the words arrive. You might feel it most when the noise fades, late at night, early in the morning, or in those moments when you're technically busy but inwardly absent. That sensation isn't trying to scare you, it's trying to get your attention. Most people have been taught to distrust this feeling. We learn early on to explain it away. We call it restlessness or midlife doubt, or just the weight of responsibilities. We medicate it with distractions. We fill the silence with sound. But notice something important. No matter how much you distract yourself, it keeps coming back. Always softer than panic, but more persistent than curiosity. That persistence matters. Random things don't return with precision. Signals do. This is what a calling feels like before it has language. It doesn't arrive as a clear message. It arrives as friction, as discomfort with the familiar, as a subtle sense that the story you've been living inside is slightly misaligned. Not wrong, just incomplete. You may look at your life from the outside and see that it works, yet something inside you doesn't settle. That doesn't mean you're ungrateful. It means part of you is no longer willing to pretend. Pay attention to how this feeling behaves. It doesn't shout, it waits. It shows up when you slow down. When you're alone in a car without music, when a conversation ends and silence stretches 1 second longer than expected, it doesn't demand action yet. It asks for honesty. And that's why it's uncomfortable. Honesty requires you to admit that the old explanations no longer satisfy you. You may also notice that this feeling doesn't come with fear at first. Fear appears later, when the mind tries to regain control. The initial sensation is closer to recognition. Almost like remembering something you never consciously learned, there's a familiarity to it, a sense of this matters, without knowing why. That's not imagination. Imagination is noisy and dramatic. This is quiet and grounded. What's happening is simple, though not easy to accept. Your awareness is beginning to turn inward instead of outward. For most of life, attention is trained to move away from the observer and toward objects, goals, roles, and expectations. Now something is gently reversing that direction. Instead of asking, "Yao, what should I do next?" there's a deeper question forming. From where am I seeing all of this? That shift creates tension. The mind prefers clear tasks and familiar identities. It likes labels. This feeling has none. It can't be solved, purchased, or completed, so the mind resists it. It tells you that you're overthinking, that you should be grateful, that others have it worse. And yet, despite all these reasonable arguments, the sensation remains. Not louder, but steadier. Here's something important to notice without judging it. When this feeling appears, your perception subtly changes. You may become more sensitive to inconsistencies. Certain conversations feel hollow. Certain routines feel mechanical. You start noticing how often people repeat ideas without examining them. Not with superiority, but with quiet surprise. It's as if a filter has thinned. The world hasn't changed, but the way you register it has. This is not a sign that something is wrong with you. It's a sign that something is becoming visible. Think of it like adjusting your eyes when moving from a dark room into daylight. At first, there's strain, not because the light is harmful, but because your vision is adapting. The discomfort is temporary, but the clarity that follows is real. You don't need to interpret this feeling yet. You don't need to give it a spiritual name or attach it to a belief system. In fact, doing so too quickly often dulls it. What matters now is observation. Notice when it appears. Notice what quiets it and what amplifies it. Notice how it feels in your body, not just in your thoughts. There's intelligence in these signals, but it's not verbal intelligence. It speaks through patterns. Many people reach this point and immediately look for answers outside themselves. That urge is understandable. We're conditioned to seek authority, guidance, and explanations from somewhere else. But before any answer can make sense, something else has to happen. You have to recognize that this calling isn't pulling you towards something external yet. It's pulling you out of anesthesia. And that's where the tension increases, because once you're no longer fully numb, you begin to see how much numbness exists around you. In habits, in systems, in conversations that never question their own assumptions. This isn't about judging others. It's about realizing how deeply trained we all are to avoid looking directly at what we feel. And once you notice that, it becomes harder to unnotice it. This is why what you're feeling matters, not because it makes you special, but because it makes you available. Available to question, to observe, to notice what most people rush past. And as this sensitivity grows, another realization starts to form naturally, without effort, that what you were taught to call normal may not be neutral at all. It may be a carefully maintained state of distraction. And that realization opens the door to a much larger, more unsettling question. One about how many people are truly awake and why so much effort seems to go into keeping them that way. Most people live anesthetized, and not because they chose to. It happened slowly, quietly, through habits that looked harmless. Little by little, attention was pulled away from direct experience and redirected toward noise, urgency, and repetition. Over time, this numbness began to feel normal, comfortable even. When everyone around you is sedated in the same way, it stops being visible. Anesthetized doesn't mean unconscious. People function, work, raise families, make plans. They laugh, argue, succeed, fail. But underneath all of that, something essential is missing. Contact. Real contact with what they feel, what they think, and what they are reacting to moment by moment. Life becomes something that happens to them, not something they are fully present inside. This state is not maintained by force, it's maintained by rhythm. Constant stimulation, constant comparison, constant urgency. There's always something to check, fix, buy, or worry about. Silence becomes uncomfortable. Stillness feels unproductive. Reflection is postponed indefinitely, not because it's forbidden, but because there's never time. And when there is time, the mind is already too tired to look inward. From a very young age, most people are trained to value answers over questions, to trust external measurements more than internal signals, grades, titles, numbers, opinions. If something cannot be immediately measured or explained, it's dismissed. Over time, this teaches a subtle lesson. What you feel directly is less reliable than what you're told. That lesson sinks deep. So when discomfort appears, like the one you've been feeling, it's quickly labeled as a problem to eliminate. Stress, anxiety, burnout, something to fix so you can return to functioning. Rarely is it treated as information. Rarely is someone encouraged to sit with it long enough to understand what it's pointing to. This is where the system reveals itself, not as a group of villains, but as a structure that rewards predictability and discourages awareness. A system that runs smoothly when people don't question the pace, the assumptions, or the direction. Awareness slows things down. It introduces pauses, and pauses are inefficient. An anesthetized person doesn't ask why they feel empty after achieving what they were told would fulfill them. They assume the next achievement will fix it. They don't question why certain conversations feel hollow. They assume that's just how adults talk. They don't notice how often their reactions are automatic, or if they do notice, they laugh it off and move on. But once awareness starts to wake up, even slightly, these patterns become hard to ignore. You begin to see how often people speak without listening, react without reflecting, agree without understanding, not because they're unintelligent, but because they're operating on borrowed scripts repeated so often they feel like personal choices. This is why waking up feels lonely at first, not because others are against you, but because you're starting to notice the distance between what is said and what is felt, between what is valued and what actually nourishes. You may find yourself wanting to slow conversations down, to go deeper, to ask questions that don't have quick answers. And you may notice resistance when you do. The resistance isn't personal, it's structural. A system built on speed, consumption, and constant output has no natural space for presence. Presence disrupts patterns. It makes people uncomfortable because it exposes how rarely they are actually here, so it gets labeled as impractical, unrealistic, or even dangerous. That's the paradox. Awareness is framed as a threat, while numbness is framed as stability. As long as people remain anesthetized, they are easier to guide, easier to predict, easier to keep moving in the same direction. Not because someone is pulling strings behind a curtain, but because the structure itself favors inertia. You may notice this when you try to change a small habit, observing instead of reacting, listening instead of interrupting, sitting in silence instead of reaching for distraction. The pushback is immediate, not always from others, but from inside. Restlessness, doubt, the urge to return to what's familiar. That internal resistance mirrors the external one. And yet something in you persists. Despite the pressure to stay numb, you're starting to feel more, not less. You're noticing subtle shifts in your perception, moments where the world feels slightly different, as if another layer is faintly visible beneath the surface. These moments don't last long, but they leave a trace. This is where the anesthetic begins to wear off. Not all at once, but in flashes. And with each flash, a quiet realization forms. Maybe what you were taught to perceive as reality is only one layer. Maybe the flatness you've sensed isn't life itself, but a limited way of engaging with it. As that thought takes shape, another question naturally follows. If this is only one layer, what else exists beyond it? What else have you been moving through without being invited to notice? And that question doesn't come from curiosity alone. It comes from recognition, from the sense that there are depths you've brushed against before, in intuition, in sudden clarity, in moments that didn't fit the usual rules. Those moments weren't accidents. They were brief openings. And now that awareness has begun to return, those openings start to feel less like exceptions and more like clues, hints that reality may be structured in ways you were never encouraged to perceive. There are levels of reality you were never invited to perceive, not because they are hidden, but because no one taught you how to look. From the beginning, perception was framed as something mechanical. Eyes see, ears hear, mind interprets. Reality was presented as a fixed surface, solid and objective, the same for everyone. You learned to trust what could be pointed to, measured, repeated. Anything else was called imagination, coincidence, or belief. But think about how often your experience contradicts that idea. Two people can live through the same moment and walk away with completely different impressions. The facts may be identical, yet the meaning is not. That difference doesn't come from the outside world. It comes from the layer of reality each person is tuned into. You've touched these layers before, even if you didn't name them that way. Moments when you sensed something before it happened. Times when a decision felt right or wrong without logical reasons. Instances where a place, a song, or a conversation carried a weight you couldn't explain. Those weren't errors in perception. They were brief access points. Most people are trained to ignore these access points. They're told to trust explanations over experience, consensus over intuition. So when something subtle appears, it gets overridden. The signal is there, but the attention needed to receive it has been dulled. Over time, only the loudest layer of reality remains, the one made of tasks, roles, schedules, and surface interactions. But reality is not flat. It's layered, like depth in sound or color. There is the obvious layer, where objects exist and events happen. Beneath that, there's a relational layer, where meaning forms based on attention, emotion, and context. And beneath that, there's an even quieter layer, where observation itself shapes what becomes visible. This doesn't require belief. It requires noticing. When you walk into a room and immediately feel tension without anyone speaking, you're not imagining it. You're perceiving a layer most people don't consciously register. When you meet someone and feel an instant sense of trust or caution, that's not magic. It's sensitivity to patterns your mind hasn't translated into words yet. The reason you were never invited to perceive these layers is simple. They can't be standardized. They don't produce the same result for everyone. And systems built on control and predictability don't know what to do with perception that varies by observer. So instead of teaching people how to refine it, they teach people how to ignore it. You learn to doubt your inner signals. You're encouraged to seek validation from outside. Over time, the subtle layers fade into the background, not because they disappear, but because attention no longer rests there. Like muscles that aren't used, perception atrophies. What's changing now is not reality itself, but your relationship to it. As the numbness loosens, perception begins to deepen. You start noticing patterns instead of isolated events. You sense timing instead of randomness. Things begin to feel connected in ways that don't fit linear explanations. This can be unsettling because it challenges the idea that reality is something you simply move through without affecting. At this level, observation matters. Not in a dramatic way, but in a quiet, consistent one. The way you pay attention alters what stands out. The questions you hold shape the answers that appear. This isn't about controlling reality. It's about participating in it more fully. That participation requires something most people were never encouraged to develop: inner stillness. Not silence for its own sake, but the ability to notice without immediately labeling or reacting. When that stillness is present, layers that were always there begin to register. You don't enter them, you recognize them. This is also why these layers are easy to dismiss. They don't announce themselves. They don't compete with noise. They're revealed only when attention slows and becomes curious rather than demanding. And because modern life rarely allows for that quality of attention, these dimensions remain unacknowledged. You may notice that when you try to explain these experiences, language feels insufficient. Words flatten what was rich. That doesn't mean the experience was vague. It means it belongs to a level of reality that isn't primarily conceptual. Trying to force it into rigid explanations can actually push you away from it. So the invitation here isn't to believe in something new. It's to stop dismissing what you already sense. To trust that your perception has more range than you were taught. To recognize that reality is not only what happens, but how it's perceived. As this recognition settles, another pattern often emerges. You may realize that you've been searching for meaning in external structures, books, systems, teachers, frameworks, hoping one of them would finally explain what you've been sensing all along. And slowly, an uncomfortable but honest question begins to form. What if the reason none of them felt complete is because the most important layer of perception was never outside to begin with? The silent mistake is not that you searched. Searching is natural. When something feels missing, the instinct is to look for it. The mistake is subtler than that. It's believing, without ever questioning it, that the answer must be somewhere outside of you. In a book you haven't read yet. In a teacher you haven't met. In a system you haven't fully understood. That belief is so common it feels like common sense. From early on, you're taught that knowledge comes from elsewhere. Someone knows more. Someone has figured it out. Someone has the map. Your role is to learn, follow, apply. There's nothing wrong with learning. The problem begins when learning replaces observing, when borrowed explanations slowly take the place of direct experience. So you read, you listen, you compare. You gather ideas, concepts, interpretations. Some of them resonate. Some feel profound for a while. But after the initial clarity fades, the same quiet emptiness returns. Not because the ideas were wrong, but because they were incomplete. They spoke to your mind, not to the place where the question originated. This is why so many people move endlessly from one framework to another. One philosophy, one method, one belief system after the next. Each promises insight, each delivers partial relief. And yet, something remains unresolved. The search continues, driven by the assumption that the missing piece is still out there. What rarely gets questioned is the direction of the search itself. Almost no one suggests turning attention back toward the one constant in every experience: the observer. Not the personality, not the story you tell about yourself, but the simple fact of awareness that has been present through every thought, every emotion, every phase of your life. This awareness doesn't advertise itself. It doesn't claim authority. It doesn't give instructions. That's why it's easy to overlook. It feels too ordinary to be important, too close to be valuable. But closeness is exactly the point. You can't step away from it to examine it as an object. You can only notice it by resting in it. Searching outside keeps you busy. It creates movement. It feels productive. Turning inward feels vague by comparison. There's no clear path, no checklist, no guarantee. And for a mind trained to seek certainty, that's uncomfortable. So it returns to what feels safer: external references, external validation, external confirmation. But notice something honest. Every time something you read truly resonates, it's not because the words are powerful on their own. It's because they trigger recognition. They point back to something you already know at a deeper level. The insight doesn't come from the page. It arises in you. The same is true for teachers, mentors, and guides. At their best, they don't give you truth. They remind you where to look. At their worst, they become substitutes for your own observation. And that's where the silent mistake deepens. Authority replaces awareness. Belief replaces attention. This doesn't mean you should reject external knowledge. It means you should change your relationship to it. Instead of asking, "Is this true?" the more honest question becomes, "What does this reveal in my own experience?" If nothing changes in how you observe, feel, or respond, then no amount of information will transform anything. The most reliable source you have is not opinion or memory, but immediate perception. How your body responds, how your attention moves, how your reactions arise before you choose them. These signals are always present, always current. They don't need interpretation to be valid. They need space to be noticed. The reason this source is ignored is not because it's unreliable, but because it doesn't flatter the ego. It doesn't make you feel special. It doesn't give you a new identity. It simply shows you what is happening without judgment. And that kind of clarity can be unsettling. It removes excuses. It removes comforting stories. Looking inward also means taking responsibility. If the source is within, then waiting becomes pointless. There's no final book, no ultimate authority, no moment when someone else hands you the answer. There's only the ongoing practice of observing honestly, and honesty, unlike belief, can't be delegated. As this realization starts to settle, you may feel a strange mix of relief and unease. Relief because the endless search begins to slow, unease because the familiar supports fall away. If the answer isn't outside, then the distance between you and it disappears, and so does the delay. This is where many people hesitate, because turning inward doesn't just reveal insight, it reveals patterns, habits, avoidances. It shows you how often you've ignored what you already sensed, and seeing that clearly changes how you relate to your own life. Once that shift begins, another question naturally arises, almost without effort. If the source has always been here, if awareness itself is the doorway, then why now? Why is this recognition happening at this moment in your life and not earlier? That question doesn't seek a mystical explanation. It points to something more immediate, something about timing, attention, and the subtle alignment that brought you here. Listening to this, exactly now. There is a reason you are watching this right now, and it has less to do with chance than you were taught to believe. Not because something mystical pushed you here, and not because an algorithm decided your fate. Those explanations are too shallow. What matters is not how you arrived, but the state you arrived in. You didn't click out of boredom. You didn't stay out of curiosity alone. Something in you recognized the tone before the words made sense. Think about your day before this moment. The small choices, the pauses, the subtle pull that made you stop scrolling, stop moving, and listen. Those moments are usually invisible. We dismiss them as coincidence. But coincidence is often just a name we give to patterns we're not yet paying attention to. You could have been doing 100 other things. There was no obligation to be here. And yet, here you are listening, not just with your ears, but with that quiet place inside that's been restless for a while. That matters. Attention is not random. It follows readiness. Most of the time, information passes through us without leaving a mark. We consume it, forget it, replace it. But every once in a while, something slows us down. It doesn't overwhelm us. It doesn't excite us excessively. It simply feels relevant in a way that's hard to explain. That relevance isn't intellectual, it's positional. It meets you where you are, not where you pretend to be. This is how alignment works. Not as destiny, but as timing. There are things you could have heard years ago that would have meant nothing. The same words, the same ideas would have bounced off. Not because they were wrong, but because you weren't in a position to receive them. Understanding doesn't depend only on content. It depends on context, and context includes your inner state. Right now, something in you is quiet enough to notice. That's the difference. The noise hasn't disappeared, but your relationship to it has shifted. You're less satisfied with surface explanations, less willing to rush past subtle signals. That change didn't happen today. It's been building. This moment is just where it becomes visible. It's tempting to call this synchronicity and stop there. But the word isn't as important as the mechanism. What's happening is that your attention is beginning to organize itself differently. Instead of being pulled only by urgency and habit, it's starting to respond to resonance. Things that match your internal questions stand out. Things that don't fade faster. This doesn't mean everything you encounter now is meaningful. It means your filter is changing. And when filters change, the world appears to respond, even though it's you who's perceiving differently. This can feel uncanny at first, as if life is suddenly answering questions you hadn't asked out loud yet. The mind wants to explain this quickly, to label it, to decide whether it's real or imagined. But explanation isn't required yet. What matters is noticing the shift without trying to own it, without turning it into a story about being chosen or special. This isn't about privilege, it's about readiness. Readiness doesn't mean clarity. You don't suddenly understand everything. In fact, you may feel more uncertain than before, but the uncertainty is honest now. It's no longer filled with borrowed answers. It's open, alert, attentive, and that quality of uncertainty is fertile. It allows new perceptions to form. Consider this carefully. If this moment were meaningless, it would pass quickly. You would already be thinking about something else. The fact that you're still here suggests that something deeper is being touched. Not taught, touched. As if a quiet agreement has been made between what's being said and what you've been sensing privately. This agreement doesn't require belief. It doesn't ask you to accept a claim. It only asks you to notice your own experience as it unfolds. Notice how your body responds. Notice whether something feels tightened or more open. These signals are more reliable than conclusions. There's also something else happening beneath the surface. A subtle reorientation of how you see yourself in relation to what you experience. Up until now, you may have felt like an isolated observer, moving through a world that feels indifferent. But as attention sharpens, that sense of isolation begins to soften. Not because you suddenly feel connected to everything, but because the boundary between inside and outside doesn't feel as rigid. You begin to sense that observation itself is part of the field. That you're not just watching life happen, but participating in it in ways you hadn't noticed before. This realization doesn't arrive as a dramatic insight. It comes as a quiet shift in perspective. And as that shift stabilizes, another thought may arise on its own without being forced. If attention can align like this, if moments can arrive with such precision, then perhaps you have never been as separate as you assumed. Perhaps what you called coincidence was interaction. Perhaps what you called solitude was never truly empty. And that opens the door to a much more challenging recognition, one about presence, observation, and the feeling that something has always been here with you long before you had words for it. The truth few can endure is not dramatic, and it doesn't announce itself with fear or wonder. It arrives quietly, almost gently, and that's what makes it difficult to face. You have never been alone, not in the way you learn to define aloneness, not in the way absence and presence were explained to you. This isn't about being watched, judged, or guided by something external. It's subtler than that and far more intimate. From childhood, aloneness was framed as physical separation. If no one was in the room, you were alone. If no one was listening, you were on your own. Over time, that idea sank deeper. Emotional distance became normal. Inner silence felt empty. Moments without stimulation felt uncomfortable, even threatening. So you learned to fill every gap. But notice something honest. Even in your most solitary moments, Something was always there, a sense of being aware, a continuity that didn't disappear when people left or situations changed. Thoughts came and went, emotions rose and faded, roles shifted, yet something remained constant, quietly observing it all. Most people never question that presence. They assume it's just me, without examining what that means. They identify with thoughts, memories, and personality traits, and call that identity. But if you look closely, you'll notice that all of those things change. What doesn't change is the fact that they are noticed. This is where the discomfort begins. Because once you recognize that there is an observing presence that has always been here, the idea of isolation starts to weaken, not disappear but lose its solidity. You may realize that what you called loneliness was often the absence of distraction, not the absence of presence. That realization can be unsettling. It challenges the narrative of being a separate self navigating an indifferent world. It raises questions you weren't trained to ask. If something has been here through every experience, untouched by circumstance, what exactly is it? And why was it never pointed out? The reason is simple. This presence can't be objectified. It can't be pointed to from the outside. It can't be packaged into a role or belief without distorting it. It can only be noticed directly. And direct noticing threatens many of the structures built around identity, control, and explanation. So instead, attention is constantly pulled outward, toward relationships, achievements, fears, and plans. As long as attention is external, the deeper presence remains unexamined. It stays in the background doing its quiet work, unnoticed and unnamed. You may have brushed against it in moments that didn't make sense, in sudden clarity during crisis, in stillness after grief, in the strange intimacy of deep silence. These moments didn't feel empty. They felt full, even if you couldn't say of what. That fullness wasn't coming from outside. It was revealed when external noise fell away. This is why the idea of never being alone is hard to endure. It removes both comfort and excuse. It means you can't fully blame emptiness on the absence of others, and you can't fully credit fulfillment to their presence either. It places responsibility back where it's uncomfortable, in your relationship with awareness itself. It also changes how you see connection. Instead of something that only happens between people, connection becomes something more fundamental. A shared field of experience, accessed individually but not owned. When you speak and someone truly listens, there's a sense of meeting that goes beyond words. That meeting doesn't belong to either person. It happens in the space between observation and response. You may notice this presence more clearly now, not as an idea, but as a felt continuity. It doesn't interfere. It doesn't direct. It doesn't comment. It simply remains. And because it doesn't demand attention, it's easy to ignore again. But once noticed, it leaves a trace. That trace changes how you experience silence. Silence stops feeling like lack and starts feeling like depth. Being alone stops meaning being cut off and starts meaning being uninterrupted. This shift doesn't solve your problems. It doesn't remove pain or uncertainty, but it changes the ground on which they appear. And this is where many people hesitate, because recognizing this presence means acknowledging that observation itself is active, not passive. That the way you attend to experience shapes what becomes real for you. And that recognition leads naturally to another realization, one that's even more unsettling. If observation is always present, if it's never been absent, then what happens when you begin to use it deliberately? Not to control life, but to truly look, to observe without distraction, without rushing to explain. What changes when attention becomes intentional rather than automatic? That question doesn't ask for belief. It asks for experimentation. And once it appears, it gently pulls you toward the next threshold, toward the moment where observation stops being background noise and starts becoming a force that subtly alters the way reality responds. When you begin to observe, truly observe, the game changes in ways that are easy to miss at first. Nothing dramatic happens on the surface. Your life doesn't suddenly transform. The same people are there. The same routines continue. But something subtle shifts in how you relate to what's happening, and once that shift begins, It quietly alters everything that follows. Before, observation was automatic. You reacted without noticing the reaction forming. Thoughts appeared and you followed them. Emotions arose and you acted from them. Life moved fast and you moved with it. Now, something slows down just enough for a small gap to appear. A pause between what happens and how you respond. That pause is where the game changes. In that pause, you start to see patterns. Not abstract ones, but living patterns in yourself. How certain words trigger the same internal tension. How the same situations pull the same reactions out of you, almost mechanically. You don't judge this at first. You simply notice it. And noticing alone weakens the grip these patterns have held for years. This is unsettling because it reveals how much of what you called choice was actually habit. How often you were living from reflex instead of awareness. But it's also freeing. Because once something is seen clearly, it can no longer fully control you. It still arises, but it doesn't own you in the same way. You may notice that people respond differently to you now, not because you're doing something intentionally, but because you're less predictable. When you observe instead of react, old dynamics lose their momentum. Conversations don't escalate the way they used to. Conflicts don't hook you as deeply. This can confuse others and it can confuse you too. At first, the mind tries to interpret this as detachment or distance, but it's not withdrawal, it's presence without entanglement. You're still there, still involved, but no longer fused with every impulse. That difference is subtle, but it's felt. Reality begins to feel more responsive, not because it's bending to your will, but because you're no longer interfering with constant, unconscious reactions. When you stop pushing, pulling, and resisting automatically, situations have room to resolve themselves differently. This can feel almost uncanny, as if life is meeting you halfway. This is where many people get uncomfortable, because it feels like responsibility is increasing. If observation changes how things unfold, then awareness matters, attention matters, and that means you can't fully hide behind circumstances anymore. You start to see how your inner state influences what you notice, how you speak, and how you act. This isn't about control. In fact, the more you try to control outcomes, the less this works. The change happens when observation is simple and honest, when you're willing to see what's actually happening rather than what you wish were happening. That kind of seeing has an effect, even without effort. You may also notice resistance from within. Old habits don't disappear quietly. The mind wants to reclaim speed and certainty. It wants conclusions. It wants to label what's happening and move on. But observation doesn't rush. It stays with what's uncomfortable long enough for something deeper to reveal itself. And this is where the emotional landscape begins to shift. Feelings you avoided before may surface more clearly, not louder, but sharper. Sadness without a clear cause. A low-level tension you can't explain. A sense of vulnerability that wasn't there before. This isn't regression. It's exposure. Observation removes the layers that kept these feelings muted, and when they emerge, it's tempting to assume something is wrong, to think you're becoming weaker, more sensitive, less stable. But what's actually happening is that you're no longer numbing yourself. You're feeling what was already there. This stage is often misunderstood. People mistake awareness for suffering because awareness reveals suffering that was previously hidden. But the suffering wasn't created by observation. It was covered by distraction, and now with fewer distractions, it has space to be seen. You may notice that this discomfort has a strange quality. It's painful, but also alive. It doesn't feel empty. It feels charged, as if something is trying to move. This is not the pain of damage. It's the pain of tension releasing, of structures loosening. And because this pain doesn't come with clear explanations, the mind searches for causes. It blames circumstances, people, age, past decisions, but none of these explanations fully satisfy. The feeling persists, asking not to be fixed, but to be understood. This is another turning point, because how you relate to this discomfort matters. If you try to suppress it, the old patterns regain control. If you dramatize it, you get lost in stories. But if you observe it with the same quiet attention you've been practicing, something unexpected happens. The discomfort begins to communicate, not in words but in direction. It points to places in your life where you've been living out of alignment, where you've been shrinking, postponing, or tolerating what no longer fits. And that realization can be deeply unsettling, because it suggests that the pain isn't a problem to eliminate, but a message to receive. Once you begin to see that, another understanding starts to form naturally, that what you've been calling pain may not be weakness at all. It may be pressure from within, trying to break through an old shell, and that pressure doesn't arrive gently. It arrives when awareness has grown strong enough to withstand it. The pain you feel is not weakness, it's not a flaw in your character, and it's not proof that something is going wrong. It's something far less comfortable and far more honest than that. It's awakening pressure, pushing from the inside, meeting structures that were built to keep things stable, predictable, and contained. For a long time, those structures served a purpose. They helped you function. They helped you adapt. They helped you survive expectations, roles, and demands that required you to stay composed, reasonable, and useful. You learned how to hold yourself together, how to stay busy, how to explain away discomfort before it became inconvenient. But awakening doesn't care about convenience. It doesn't arrive gently, asking permission. It arrives when the shell you've been living inside becomes too small for what you're becoming. And shells don't dissolve quietly. They crack under pressure. This is why the pain feels confusing. There's often no clear cause, nothing obvious to fix. From the outside, your life may look fine. From the inside, something feels tight, restless, almost urgent. You may feel sadness without a story, anger without a target, or a heaviness that doesn't match your circumstances. That mismatch is what makes you doubt yourself. So the mind looks for explanations. It calls it burnout, midlife crisis, sensitivity, overthinking. And sometimes those labels offer temporary relief, but they don't fully explain why the pain feels purposeful, why it seems to be asking something of you, rather than simply demanding escape. Weakness seeks avoidance. This pain doesn't. It seeks attention. Notice how it behaves. It intensifies when you slow down. It becomes louder in silence. It doesn't disappear when you distract yourself. It just waits. That's not the behavior of something broken. That's the behavior of something that wants to be acknowledged. What's breaking is not you. What's breaking is the layer you built to protect yourself from feeling too much, questioning too deeply, or seeing too clearly. That layer did its job for a long time, but now it's in the way. This is why awakening pain often feels like loss. You may grieve versions of yourself that once felt solid, certainties you relied on, beliefs that gave you direction. The pain isn't just emotional, it's existential. It touches identity. And identity resists change fiercely because it confuses stability with safety. You might notice this resistance as self-criticism. Thoughts like, "I should be past this," or "Others handle life better than I do." These thoughts aren't true assessments. They're defense mechanisms. They try to push you back into the shell because the unknown feels risky, but the shell is already cracking, and that's why forcing yourself back into old patterns feels exhausting now. What once worked no longer holds. You can still perform it, but it costs more energy. It feels hollow. The pain is pointing that out. Awakening pain is not dramatic. It doesn't come with visions or certainty. It comes with vulnerability, with the unsettling feeling of not knowing who you are becoming, with the sense that something essential is trying to emerge, but hasn't fully formed yet. This in-between state is uncomfortable because there's nothing to grasp. No clear identity to adopt, no immediate relief. You're too aware to go back to numbness, but not clear enough to move forward confidently. That tension hurts, and yet there's intelligence in it. Pressure exists for a reason. In nature, growth often requires resistance. Muscles strengthen under strain. Seeds split before they sprout. The discomfort is not an error in the process, it is the process. If you observe the pain instead of fighting it, you may notice something subtle. Beneath the heaviness, there's a strange sense of aliveness, a rawness that feels more real than the polished calm you once maintained. That rawness is not pleasant, but it is honest. Honesty is what awakening demands. It strips away the stories you used to justify staying small, staying silent, staying busy. It exposes where you've been compromising your own awareness to keep things running smoothly, and that exposure hurts because it removes excuses. This is why many people retreat at this stage. They numb themselves again. They fill every quiet space. They return to old roles with renewed discipline, not because those roles fit, but because the pain of transformation feels too uncertain. But if you stay with it, something begins to shift. The pain stops feeling like an enemy and starts feeling like information. It shows you where attention is needed, where truth has been avoided, where life is asking for a different kind of participation. This doesn't mean the pain disappears quickly. It means it changes texture. It becomes less sharp, more instructive, less personal, more directional. And as that happens, another realization begins to surface, one that reframes the entire struggle. You may start to see that the real prison was never the pain itself. It was the structures you built to avoid it, the habits, beliefs, and emotional walls that kept everything contained. And once that becomes visible, another question naturally arises. If those walls were internal all along, then what happens when you stop maintaining them? The true prison has no walls, no guards, no visible bars. You can travel freely, speak freely, choose freely, and still live entirely confined. That's what makes this prison so effective. It doesn't announce itself as captivity. It presents itself as normal life. This prison is built from thoughts you didn't choose, emotional patterns you inherited, and beliefs you absorbed before you were old enough to question them. None of it feels imposed because it feels familiar, and familiarity is often mistaken for truth. The mental part of the prison is subtle. It's the constant commentary in your head that interprets everything before you even notice what's happening. It tells you who you are, what's possible, what's realistic. It repeats the same conclusions again and again until they feel like facts. You rarely question this voice because it speaks in your own tone. It sounds like you. The emotional part is even quieter. It's made of unprocessed experiences, learned reactions, and old defenses. You feel something rise, and before you're aware of it, you're already responding in the same way you always have. Certain emotions feel allowed, others feel dangerous, so you suppress, avoid, or redirect them, not consciously, but automatically. Over time, this creates an emotional range that feels safe but limited. Then there's the spiritual part of the prison, which is often misunderstood. It's not about religion or belief. It's about disconnection from direct experience. It's the habit of living entirely on the surface, never resting in awareness itself. Life becomes something you manage, not something you inhabit. Meaning is outsourced. Depth is postponed. What makes this prison convincing is that it rewards compliance. If you stay within its boundaries, things tend to work smoothly enough. You meet expectations. You function. You're seen as stable, reasonable, successful. Stepping outside doesn't bring immediate rewards. It brings uncertainty, friction, and questions without answers. So most people stay in. The prison doesn't require force. It only requires repetition. Repeating the same thoughts until they feel inevitable. Repeating the same emotional responses until they feel like personality. Repeating the same distractions until stillness feels uncomfortable. Eventually, the door is unlocked, but no one tries to open it. You may notice this when you attempt something simple but unfamiliar, sitting quietly without reaching for a device, questioning a belief you've always accepted, responding differently in a familiar situation. The resistance is immediate, not dramatic, but persistent. A feeling of wrongness, restlessness, or subtle fear. That reaction isn't coming from reality. It's coming from the prison defending its structure. This is where awareness becomes threatening. When you begin to observe your thoughts instead of believing them, cracks appear. When you feel emotions without acting them out, space opens. When you rest in awareness without needing explanation, something loosens. The prison starts to feel less solid. But this is also where discomfort increases. Because the prison provided identity. It told you who you were. When its walls begin to fade, there's a sense of groundlessness. If you're not your habitual thoughts, not your automatic reactions, not your inherited beliefs, then who are you? This question can feel destabilizing. The mind wants a quick replacement, a new identity, a new label. But replacing one prison with another doesn't create freedom. It just changes the decor. True freedom isn't the absence of structure. It's the ability to see structure clearly without being owned by it. It's noticing a thought arise without immediately following it, feeling an emotion without being consumed by it, being aware of a belief without confusing it for reality itself. This kind of freedom doesn't make life easier in the usual sense. It makes life more honest. You begin to see how often you've been choosing safety over truth, familiarity over clarity, and that recognition can be uncomfortable. It removes the illusion that something outside is keeping you trapped. The prison persists only as long as it's unexamined. Once seen, it doesn't vanish instantly, but it loses authority. You can still walk its corridors, but you know they're optional. You start to notice moments where you could respond differently, think differently, feel more openly. Those moments are small, but they accumulate, and with accumulation comes a shift that's hard to reverse. Because once you see that the walls were internal, that they were maintained by attention and habit, you can't unsee it. You may try to ignore it, you may try to return to the old comfort, but something fundamental has changed. There's a growing awareness now, one that follows you into quiet moments, into dreams, into pauses between words. It doesn't argue with you. It simply observes, and that observation keeps revealing the same thing again and again. That freedom was never outside the prison, because the prison itself was never truly outside you. And once that becomes clear, another threshold appears, one that marks a point of no return. Because seeing this isn't just information, it's a change in perception. And perception, once expanded, doesn't contract back to its old limits. There is a point where understanding stops being optional, not because someone forces it on you, but because perception has shifted enough that going back would require pretending. This is the point of no return. Once you see, you cannot unsee, not because you're trapped, but because something fundamental has been recognized. Before this point, insight felt temporary. You could have moments of clarity, and then fall back into old habits without much friction. Forgetting was easy, distraction worked. Life pulled you forward, and awareness followed behind. But now, something is different. Even when you try to return to old ways of thinking, there's a quiet tension, a sense of dishonesty, not guilt, recognition. You may notice this in small, almost trivial moments. You catch yourself reacting automatically and immediately see it happening. You still react, but the blindness is gone. Or you hear yourself repeating a familiar belief and realize in real time that it no longer feels true. You may continue the conversation, but something inside doesn't fully participate. This is what unseeing would require, suppressing what you now notice. And suppression takes energy. Awareness, once awake, doesn't go back to sleep easily. It lingers, it watches, it waits. This doesn't mean life becomes constantly intense or serious. In fact, it can become simpler. But it does mean that shortcuts lose their appeal. You can still distract yourself, but the distraction feels thinner. You can still lie to yourself, but the lie feels louder. Something keeps tapping you on the shoulder, not accusing, just present. Many people resist this stage because it feels like loss. You lose the innocence of believing your thoughts without question. You lose the comfort of blaming circumstances without looking inward. You lose the ease of being fully unconscious. And those losses are real, they deserve to be acknowledged, but there's also a quiet gain. You gain honesty, not moral honesty, but perceptual honesty. You see more clearly how things work inside you, how emotions arise, how stories form, how fear disguises itself as reason. That clarity doesn't always feel good, but it feels real. This is why this point is so difficult to endure. It removes the option of full denial. You can still resist change, but you can no longer claim ignorance, at least partially, that your inner world shapes how you experience everything else. And that knowledge carries weight. You may try to compartmentalize it, to keep awareness in certain areas and not others, to be awake in private but functional in public. That works for a while, but awareness has a way of spreading. It seeps into conversations, decisions, relationships, not loudly but steadily. You might notice that you tolerate less of what once seemed acceptable, less noise, less pretense, less self-betrayal. This doesn't make you superior. It makes you sensitive. And sensitivity, in a world built on numbing, can feel like a burden. At times you may wish you could go back to simpler explanations, back to clear roles, back to certainty. That wish is understandable. But notice this. Even the wish is observed. There's a part of you that watches the desire to forget, and that watcher doesn't disappear. That watcher is the reason there's no true return. You can revisit old patterns, but you don't fully inhabit them anymore. You're aware of the cost. You feel the friction. You sense the misalignment. This stage often brings a strange mix of humility and responsibility. Humility because you realize how little control you actually have. Responsibility because you see how much attention matters, not as effort, but as orientation. Where you place it, what you ignore, what you allow to pass unexamined. You may also notice that others sense the change in you before you can explain it. They may say you seem different, quieter, more distant, or more present. Often they can't say exactly what it is, and neither can you, because this change isn't about personality. It's about perspective. This perspective doesn't give you answers to everything. In fact, it often replaces answers with better questions. Questions that don't seek closure but clarity. Questions that don't rush to conclusion but stay open. And this is where the point of no return quietly becomes a point of choice. Not a dramatic choice, but a continuous one. Moment by moment. Will you meet experience with awareness or retreat into habit? Will you listen to what's being revealed or cover it with noise? You can't unknow what you know now, but you can decide how honestly you live with it. And that decision doesn't announce itself with certainty. It shows up as subtle responsibility, as the growing sense that whatever comes next won't be imposed from outside. It will come from how you choose to relate to what you already see. You are closer than ever, even if it doesn't feel dramatic or clear. Closer doesn't mean finished. It means aware enough to notice that something real is happening inside you. You felt the discomfort, the questions, the quiet pressure that won't go away. That's not a problem to solve. It's a signal that you're no longer asleep to your own experience. Nothing here forces you to change. There is no obligation to act, no identity you need to adopt, no belief you must accept. The only thing that has shifted is that you see more than you did before. And with that comes a simple, honest choice: to keep living on autopilot, or to stay present with what you already know is true for you. If you made it to the end, write this exact phrase in the comments, so I know you're here with me. I am choosing to see. And if this connected with you, watch one of the videos appearing on your screen now. If you want more content like this, that's where the next step continues.